In the northern district of Kaya, a new green park had been unveiled to the public with great fanfare. Along the riverbank, lush greenery, sparkling fountains, and decorative lights created an atmosphere so enchanting that it seemed as if nature itself had reclaimed its smile. Children played freely on the manicured lawns. Elderly couples strolled hand in hand along the winding pathways, and street vendors sold roasted corn at the entrance gates. The local newspapers had hailed it as a triumph of urban development, a testament to progress in a nation struggling to balance growth with environmental stewardship. Yet, despite the celebrations and the apparent success, President Ibrahim Traoré carried an unshakable unease in his heart. 3 days earlier, he had received a peculiar report from the Environmental Assessment Team, a document that should have been routine but contained one extraordinary sentence that refused to leave his mind. The water is indeed clean, but beneath its surface, certain metals possess an unusual luminescence. The language was deliberately vague, almost cautiously evasive, as if the authors themselves were uncertain whether to sound an alarm or dismiss their findings as mere anomalies. But Traoré had learned long ago that the most dangerous truths often announce themselves in whispers rather than shouts. His years of military service before ascending to the presidency had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that something was profoundly wrong. He made a decision that would have shocked his security detail had they known in advance. He would visit Kaya Park without any protocol, without the usual presidential motorcade, without advance warning to local officials. He wanted to see the park as his people saw it, to feel the ground beneath his feet without the filter of bureaucratic preparation. On a humid Thursday morning, Traoré dressed in civilian clothes, simple cotton trousers and a plain shirt that any working man might wear. He was accompanied only by 2 bodyguards in equally unremarkable attire and a single photographer whose camera hung casually around his neck. They drove to Kaya in an unmarked vehicle, windows down, breathing the same air as everyone else on the road. When they arrived at the park, the small group blended seamlessly with the morning visitors. Families were gathered near the fountain, tourists were taking selfies by the flower beds, and joggers traced the perimeter path in their morning routines. For several minutes, no one recognized the tall figure walking slowly along the riverside, his eyes scanning not the beauty above ground but the earth itself. Then, a local man, a shopkeeper who had lived in Kaya all his life, happened to look up from arranging his fruit stand. His eyes widened in disbelief. He approached hesitantly, then, with growing certainty, finally exclaiming with joy, "Mr. President! Is it really you? Here among us?" Word spread quickly, and within moments a small crowd had gathered. But rather than showing annoyance at having his anonymity broken, Traoré smiled warmly and engaged with the people. One elderly woman, her face weathered by decades under the African sun, clasped his hand with both of hers. "Mr. President," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "the fragrance here has changed completely. There was a time when passing this place was unbearable. The stench from the polluted river made us cover our noses and hurry past. Now look, it's paradise!" Traoré smiled gently, but his eyes remained serious. "When a fragrance changes," he said softly, "it doesn't necessarily mean that intentions have changed as well. Sometimes perfume is used to mask decay." The woman looked confused by his cryptic response, but before she could ask what he meant, Traoré had already moved toward the water's edge. He knelt down by the riverbank, where the morning sun created dancing patterns on the gentle current. Slowly, deliberately, he dipped his fingers into the cool water. When he withdrew his hand, something caught the light, a faint golden shimmer on his fingertips, barely visible, but undeniably present. He brought his hand close to his face and inhaled deeply, his expression darkening. "Water doesn't speak," he said quietly, almost to himself, "but soil always tells a story. The question is whether we're willing to listen." The project manager, who had been notified of the presidential presence and rushed to the scene, pushed through the growing crowd. He was sweating despite the morning coolness, his expensive suit already showing dark patches under the arms. "Your Excellency," he said breathlessly, "I assure you, those are merely mineral particles. Completely natural. No danger whatsoever. The environmental report cleared everything." Traoré stood up slowly, his full height suddenly intimidating. He fixed the manager with a penetrating stare that had made hardened soldiers uncomfortable. "Danger," he said in a voice that carried, despite its quietness, is always silent before it strikes. Truth trembles in the ground before it erupts to the surface. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but Traoré had already turned his attention elsewhere. Near a newly constructed pergola, a group of construction workers sat in the shade, eating their breakfast. They were speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing nervously toward the officials. Traoré approached them directly, brushing past the manager who tried to intercept him. "Good morning, brothers," Traoré said, addressing the workers. "May I join you for a moment?" The workers scrambled to their feet, some dropping their food in shock. But Traoré gestured for them to sit and lowered himself to the ground beside them, cross-legged like any other man taking a break from labor. "Please, relax. I'm not here for inspections or formalities. I simply want to understand this place. You're the ones who built it. You know its secrets." There was a long silence. The workers exchanged glances, clearly torn between fear of repercussion and a desperate need to unburden themselves. Finally, the youngest among them, a man barely in his 20s with calloused hands and honest eyes, gathered his courage. "Sir," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "machines run here at night. Heavy machinery. We were told it was for maintenance, but—" He paused, swallowing hard. Large boxes were buried. Metal containers. Then, before sunrise, concrete was poured over them. The air became heavy afterward. Hard to breathe. Some of us developed headaches that wouldn't go away. Another worker, older and with a deep scar across his forearm, added, "We were paid extra to keep quiet. Told it was part of the beautification process, that the public wouldn't understand the technical aspects. But, sir, I've worked construction for 30 years. What we did here, that wasn't construction. It was concealment." Traoré listened without interruption, his face impassive but his mind racing. When the workers fell silent, he stood and turned to the project manager, who had gone pale. "Show me exactly where this happened," Traoré commanded. The manager's composure cracked. "Your Excellency, with all due respect, any digging would damage the park. We've just completed the landscaping. The opening ceremony—" "If one hole can destroy this park," Traoré interrupted, his voice sharp as steel, "then this park was already built on a foundation of lies. Bring excavation equipment. Now." Within an hour, a small excavator arrived, along with additional security personnel. A crowd had gathered at the park's perimeter, kept back by hastily erected barriers, but watching with intense curiosity. News crews began arriving, having caught wind that something significant was unfolding. Traoré had identified a specific location based on the workers' directions, an area near the central fountain where the concrete seemed newer, slightly different in color from the surrounding pathways. He stood beside the excavator operator, personally directing where to dig. "Carefully," he instructed. "We're not looking to destroy. We're searching for truth." The excavator's arm swung into position, and its bucket bit into the decorative paving stones, lifting them aside to reveal the soil beneath. As the digging progressed, the crowd pressed closer, despite the security cordon. Even the police officers maintaining order seemed transfixed by what might be discovered. At approximately 1 meter depth, the excavator's bucket struck something solid with a metallic clang that echoed across the park. The operator stopped immediately, looking to Traoré for guidance. "Continue, but by hand now," Traoré ordered. Workers jumped into the shallow pit with shovels and began carefully removing earth. Within minutes, they had exposed a large metal surface, rusted in places but clearly of recent construction. It was a container, roughly the size of a small car, made of reinforced steel. As they cleared more soil away, lettering became visible on the container's side. The crowd gasped audibly as someone read it aloud. "Property of Afrique Mining Development." Traoré's jaw tightened. That company name was familiar, infamously so. 5 years earlier, Afrique Mining Development had been at the center of a scandal involving illegal extraction of rare earth minerals from protected lands. The company had been shut down, its licenses revoked, its leadership supposedly banned from operating in Burkina Faso. Or so everyone had believed. "Open it," Traoré commanded. The project manager, who had been standing to the side in what appeared to be shock, suddenly sprang forward. "Your Excellency, this could be dangerous. We don't know what's inside. It could be toxic, it could be—" "Then we'd better find out," Traoré said coldly. "Unless you already know what's inside?" The manager fell silent, retreating into the crowd of officials. Two workers used crowbars to pry open the container's sealed lid. The metal groaned and creaked, resisting, but finally gave way. As the lid swung open, a sharp, acrid smell of metal and chemicals wafted out, causing several people to step back and cover their noses. Inside were stacks of files, water-damaged but readable plastic-sealed bags containing what appeared to be mineral samples, and several smaller metal boxes. Traoré reached in and pulled out one of the files. The presidential seal of Burkina Faso was stamped on its cover, but the date had been deliberately obscured, scraped away, or bleached out. He opened the file and began reading. The crowd waited in absolute silence, broken only by the rustle of turning pages and the distant sound of the river. "This park is new," Traoré finally said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "But these files smell of old corruption." He handed the file to his advisor, who had arrived shortly after the excavation began. The advisor's hands trembled slightly as he leafed through the documents. "Your Excellency," the advisor said, his voice strained. "This is documentation for the same company, a freak mining development, that was supposedly shut down 5 years ago. These are survey reports, extraction permits, financial transfers." He paused, his eyes widening. "Sir, these documents indicate that mining operations never actually stopped. They just went underground, literally." Traoré picked up one of the sealed bags containing mineral samples. Even through the plastic, he could see the distinctive coloring, traces of coltan, tantalum, and what appeared to be gold dust. "So," he said slowly, piecing together the truth as he spoke, "beneath this park, wealth was buried, and someone threw green paint over a black heart, hoping no one would look beneath the surface." He turned to face the project manager directly. The man was sweating profusely now, despite the relatively cool morning air. "These are old records," the manager stammered. "Perhaps they were buried by mistake during the land clearing before construction." "It's possible that—" "Mistakes," Traoré interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet, "are not buried with this much care. Mistakes are not sealed in waterproof containers with intact company logos. This wasn't burial. This was concealment." He reached back into the container and pulled out a receipt, its paper crisp despite the conditions. His eyes scanned the document, and his expression grew even grimmer. 3.2 billion CFA francs, he read aloud. The crowd murmured in shock. It was an astronomical sum, listed as material transfer for park beautification. This wasn't beautification. This was makeup to cover a crime. Traoré turned to the photographer who had accompanied him. "Are you recording all of this?" The photographer nodded, his camera having captured every moment. "Good," Traoré said, "because the people need to see this. They were told this park was built for nature, for their enjoyment, for their children. In reality, it was built to hide the rape of their land." The young construction worker who had first spoken up approached Traoré again, clearly wrestling with whether to reveal more. Traoré noticed and gave him an encouraging nod. "Sir," the worker said, his voice steadier now, "there's something else. We were always told to work the night shifts, 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. We were specifically instructed never to work when it was light out, never to allow cameras or phones on the site during those hours. The day shift would come in and do the visible work, planting flowers, installing lights. But the real work happened in darkness." "What kind of work?" Traoré asked, digging, deep digging. "Sometimes we'd go down 5-6 meters. We'd hit these tunnels, old mining tunnels from years ago. We were told to reinforce them, to create passages. Then we'd move containers down into them. Heavy containers that took 4 men to carry, even with equipment." Another worker added, "Sometimes trucks would come in the middle of the night with no headlights. They'd back up to certain areas and we'd load bags into them. The bags looked like they contained soil, but they were too heavy. and they caught the moonlight strangely, like they had something metallic inside. Traoré processed this information, his mind constructing a picture of systematic, organized theft. This wasn't opportunistic corruption. This was an operation. Night, he said to no one in particular, isn't meant for darkness. It's meant for conscience. And some people's consciences prefer to sleep. He turned to address the growing crowd of officials who had gathered. Ministers, local government representatives, police commanders. This park is no longer a recreational site. As of this moment, it is a crime scene. I want a complete investigation team assembled. Engineers, geologists, forensic accountants, environmental scientists. We will map every centimeter of this ground. We will find every tunnel, every hidden container, every stolen gram of our national wealth. To the police commander, he said, seal this entire area. No one enters or leaves without authorization. Post guards at every entrance. If anyone attempts to remove anything from this site, arrest them immediately. That night, Traoré made a decision that concerned his security detail. He would personally oversee the excavation operation. Despite their protests about safety and protocol, he was adamant. If I ask my people to fight corruption, he said, I cannot do so from behind a desk in an air-conditioned office. I must be willing to get dirt under my fingernails just as they do. As evening fell over Kaya Park, powerful floodlights were erected, transforming the area into a surreal nighttime construction site. The general public had been cleared away, but Traoré ensured that journalists remained, their cameras documenting everything, based on the workers' testimonies. The investigation team identified 3 primary locations where night operations had been most intensive. Excavation began at all 3 sites simultaneously. At the first site, diggers quickly encountered a concrete platform just below the surface. When they broke through it, they found a vertical shaft leading downward, reinforced with modern steel beams that gleamed in the floodlights. The shaft was approximately 2 meters in diameter and descended into darkness. I'm going down, Traoré announced. His chief of security immediately objected. Sir, we have no idea what's down there. Let us send in a team first. Secure it, then— No, Traoré said firmly. I lead from the front. That's not a metaphor. Bring ropes and lights. 5 minutes later, Traoré was being lowered into the shaft, a powerful torch strapped to his helmet. The descent took nearly 3 minutes, passing through layers of soil, bedrock, and then into an open space. When his feet touched solid ground, he found himself in a tunnel. Not a natural cave, but a deliberately constructed passage. The tunnel walls were reinforced with timber and metal brackets, much like traditional mining tunnels, but the construction was recent. The wood hadn't yet developed the decay of age. Along the walls at regular intervals were fixtures for lighting, though the bulbs had been removed. Traoré's torch beams swept through the darkness, revealing that the tunnel extended in both directions. He chose to go deeper into the hillside, away from the park's surface. His footsteps echoed in the confined space, and he could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. After approximately 50 meters, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Traoré's torch illuminated stacks upon stacks of sacks, hundreds of them, piled nearly to the ceiling. He approached one, cut it open with a knife, and poured some of its contents into his hand. Under the torchlight, the material glittered, a mixture of soil and small metallic fragments that caught the light with a golden sheen. He knew immediately what he was looking at: processed ore, ready for refinement. This wasn't raw earth. This was the product of systematic extraction, probably running continuously for months or even years. On the wall of the chamber, someone had spray-painted coordinates and a series of codes. Traoré photographed them with his phone, then continued deeper into the tunnel system. The passages formed a network, branching and reconnecting. At several junctions, he found evidence of recent activity: fresh boot prints in the dust, discarded water bottles, even a jacket hung on a wall hook. In one tunnel, he discovered something that made his blood run cold: a mobile office setup. There was a desk, a computer, now removed, with only the connecting cables remaining, filing cabinets emptied, and a whiteboard covered in production, numbers, and shipping schedules. The most recent date on the whiteboard was from just 2 weeks ago. Long after the park had officially opened, Traoré spent nearly 2 hours underground, mapping the extent of the operation in his mind. When he finally returned to the surface, his clothes were covered in dirt, his face smudged with dust, but his eyes blazed with cold fury. "What we have discovered," he told the assembled investigators and journalists, "is not merely corruption. This is organized theft on a national scale. This park was not built to honor nature. It was built as camouflage for the systematic looting of our country's mineral wealth." Over the next several days, while the physical excavation continued at Kaya Park, a parallel investigation was launched into the financial aspects of the operation. Traoré assembled a team of forensic accountants, retired judges known for their integrity, and international experts in tracking illicit financial flows. The investigation led them to a complex web of shell companies, false invoicing, and money laundering. The trail was deliberately complicated, designed to confuse and discourage anyone trying to follow it. But Traoré's team was relentless. They discovered that the official budget for Kaya Park's construction had been 8 billion CFA francs. However, the actual spending on legitimate park construction, landscaping, fountains, lighting, pathways, totaled only about 3 billion francs. The remaining 5 billion had been siphoned off through a series of fraudulent contracts. One company appeared repeatedly in the documentation: Rare Met Holdings. On paper, it was a consulting firm specializing in environmental assessment and urban development. In reality, it was a front for mining operations. The company had been registered just 2 years earlier, shortly after the park project was first announced. Its nominal owner was listed as a businessman named Marcel Caboret, but further investigation revealed that Caboret was merely a proxy. The real power behind Rare Met Holdings traced back to Bhaskara Duogo, a former minister who had left government under a cloud of allegations related to mining corruption. But Duogo wasn't working alone. The investigation uncovered email exchanges, encrypted but eventually decoded, showing communication with current government officials, foreign mining interests, and even some members of the military who had been bribed to ensure security for the clandestine operations. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't a few corrupt individuals taking advantage of a construction project. This was a coordinated effort involving dozens of people across multiple institutions, all working together to systematically steal from the nation. On the 6th day of the investigation, as more evidence was being gathered and more arrest warrants were being prepared, something happened that changed everything. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, a massive explosion rocked the outskirts of Ouagadougou, the capital city. The blast was so powerful that windows shattered in buildings several blocks away, and a column of black smoke rose high into the sky. The explosion had occurred at the residence of Bhaskara Duogo. Traoré was in a meeting at the presidential palace when he received the news. His first instinct was correct. This was no accident. Someone was trying to destroy evidence, to eliminate witnesses, or both. He immediately mobilized his security forces and personally led a convoy to the site. When they arrived, the scene was one of devastation. The main house had been reduced to rubble, with fires still burning in several locations. Emergency responders were searching for survivors, but the chances seemed slim. Traoré walked through the destruction, his trained military eye analyzing the blast pattern. "This was not a gas leak," he told his security chief. "Look at the distribution of debris. This was multiple explosive charges placed strategically. Whoever did this knew exactly how to bring down the structure." Investigators combing through the ruins found the remains of a small safe that had survived the explosion, its contents protected by its position in a reinforced section of the building's foundation. Inside were several flash drives and a stack of partially burned documents. One document in particular caught Traoré's attention. It was a contract signed 2 years earlier between Rare Met Holdings and someone identified only as D. Sagano. But Traoré recognized that name, Dr. David Sagano, the former Minister of Mining and Industrial Development, who had resigned suddenly 3 years ago citing health reasons. The document outlined a profit-sharing agreement related to rare earth element extraction from designated sites in Kaya region. The signatures were witnessed by a notary, and the document bore the seal of what appeared to be an offshore legal firm. This document, Traoré said, holding it carefully, is direct evidence linking the highest levels of former government to this theft. But there was a problem. The flash drives were encrypted, and initial attempts to access them failed. Traoré made the decision to send them to international specialists in France, knowing this would take time, but also knowing that the data they contained might be crucial. Meanwhile, Bhaskara Duogo was nowhere to be found. His body was not among those recovered from the explosion site, which meant either he had somehow survived and was in hiding, or he had never been in the building when it exploded. As news of the investigation spread, public reaction intensified. What had started as a story about a park became a national conversation about corruption, accountability, and the future of Burkina Faso. Protests erupted in major cities, with thousands taking to the streets. But these were not protests against Traoré's government. Instead, they were demonstrations of support for the investigation, with people demanding that no one be spared, regardless of their position or connections. Young people, in particular, galvanized around the issue. University students organized teach-ins about resource theft and neo-colonialism. Artists created murals depicting the golden mud of Kaya Park. Musicians wrote songs about the need for transparency and justice. Social media exploded with hashtags like Kaya Truth and Burkina Awakening. Citizens began sharing their own stories of corruption they had witnessed or experienced, creating a cascade of revelations that went far beyond the park scandal. One particularly viral post came from a geology student at the University of Ouagadougou. She had written a detailed thread explaining the value of the minerals being stolen from Kaya. Coltan and tantalum are essential for manufacturing smartphones, laptops, and electric vehicles. A single kilogram can sell for hundreds of dollars on the international market. The amount that appears to have been extracted from Kaya could be worth tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. This isn't just our land being stolen, it's our future, our development, our children's inheritance. The international community also began paying attention. Media outlets from France, the United States, and across Africa sent journalists to Burkina Faso to cover the story. International mining companies that operated legally in the country issued statements condemning the illegal operations. Though some skeptical observers noted that these companies had been surprisingly quiet when the theft was actually occurring. Traoré used this momentum carefully. He appeared on national television to provide regular updates on the investigation, speaking directly to the people in a way that was unprecedented for a head of state. "My fellow citizens," he said in one broadcast, "what we are witnessing is not just about one park or one group of criminals. This is about whether we will be a nation that allows itself to be robbed in broad daylight, or whether we will stand up and say, enough. Our resources belong to our people. Our future belongs to our children. And we will not allow anyone, no matter how powerful, no matter how connected, to steal that future." His words resonated powerfully, particularly among young people who had grown cynical about politics and government. Here was a leader who seemed genuinely committed to fighting the corruption that had plagued the country for decades. 2 weeks after the initial discovery at Kaya Park, the investigation had gathered enough evidence to begin making arrests. Traoré had insisted on an absolutely by-the-book approach. Every arrest had to be legally justified, every warrant had to be properly issued, every right had to be respected. He knew that if they cut corners now, the guilty might escape on technicalities later. The first wave of arrests targeted the operational level, engineers who had overseen the clandestine mining, contractors who had built the concealment infrastructure, and security personnel who had been paid to look the other way. These arrests happened simultaneously in a coordinated operation across 3 provinces, ensuring that suspects couldn't warn each other or flee. The second wave went higher. Several current government officials were taken into custody, including a deputy minister and 2 members of parliament. The charges included embezzlement, abuse of office, and conspiracy to defraud the state. But the most dramatic arrest came on a rainy morning in the capital. Dr. David Sagano, The former mining minister was apprehended at the airport as he attempted to board a flight to Paris. In his luggage, customs officials found nearly 200,000 euros in cash and several external hard drives. When Sagano was brought before the investigating magistrate, he initially maintained his innocence. But when confronted with the burned contract bearing his signature, his story began to change. First, he claimed he had signed the document without reading it, trusting his advisors. Then, when that explanation was rejected, he blamed Bhaskara Duogo, claiming he had been manipulated. Traoré watched the interrogation via video feed from the presidential palace. Beside him sat his chief legal advisor, a woman named Aminata Diallo, who had spent 15 years as a prosecutor before joining the administration. "He's lying," Diallo said flatly. "Look at his body language. He's trying to figure out exactly how much we know before deciding what to admit to." Traoré nodded. "Let him lie. Every lie creates more contradictions, more chances for the truth to emerge. The evidence will speak louder than his words." Indeed, as the interrogation continued, Sagano's story became increasingly incoherent. When presented with bank records showing large deposits into his accounts that coincided with mining extraction periods, he claimed they were loans from friends. When those friends denied making any such loans, he claimed they were mistaken. Finally, after 6 hours of questioning, Sagano broke down. Through tears, he admitted his role in the conspiracy, though he continued to claim he was not the mastermind. "Duogo planned everything," he said. I just signed the papers. I knew it was wrong, but the money, my family needed it, and everyone else was doing it, so why shouldn't I?" The magistrate's response was cold. "Everyone was doing it? Then everyone will face justice." While the arrests proceeded, one crucial figure remained elusive: Bhaskara Duogo himself. Despite a national manhunt and alerts at all border crossings, he seemed to have vanished. Traoré suspected that Duogo had help, that there were people within the system still protecting him. He couldn't know who to trust completely, so he assembled a small, hand-picked team to track Duogo down. This team included military intelligence officers, a cybersecurity expert, and a detective from the national police who had a reputation for incorruptibility. Their investigation revealed that Duogo had likely not been in his house when it exploded because he had already fled the country. Using his connections, he had managed to cross into a neighboring nation before the border alerts were issued. From there, his trail went cold, but the cybersecurity expert, a young man named Yakuba who had studied in Germany, found a digital thread to pull. Duogo's wife, apparently unaware of the extent of her husband's troubles, had continued using her social media accounts. By analyzing metadata from her photos and posts, Yakuba was able to determine that she was in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. "If we can locate her," Yakuba explained to Traoré, "there's a good chance she'll either lead us to Duogo or know how to reach him." Traoré contacted the Ivorian authorities, and with their cooperation, Duogo's wife was located at a luxury hotel in Abidjan's Plateau district. When questioned, not arrested, as she had not been charged with any crime, she initially denied knowing where her husband was. But when investigators explained the full scope of what Duogo had done, including the fact that the explosion at their home might have been intended to kill potential witnesses, possibly including her, her loyalty began to waver. "He called me 2 days ago," she finally admitted. "He wouldn't tell me where he was calling from, but I could hear airport announcements in the background. He said he was going somewhere safe, somewhere without an extradition treaty. Airport announcements. That was something." Yakuba got to work analyzing the audio from the phone call, which Ivorian authorities had recorded as part of their investigation. Using sophisticated audio analysis software, he was able to identify the specific airport from the announcement cadence and background sounds: Félix Houphouët-Boigny International Airport in Abidjan. But which flight had Duogo taken? The team pored over passenger manifests for every international flight departing in the relevant time window. Duogo was too smart to use his own name. But they looked for patterns: single male travelers, last-minute bookings, cash payments. One name stood out: Marcel Nikiema, who had booked a one-way ticket to Conakry, Guinea, paying in cash just hours before departure. The name itself was generic enough to be an alias, and Guinea's governance challenges made it a plausible destination for someone trying to avoid extradition. Traoré contacted the Guinean authorities, explaining the situation and requesting their cooperation. Guinea's president, aware of the international attention on the case and not wanting his country to be seen as a haven for corrupt officials, agreed to help. 3 days later, Bhaskara Duogo was arrested at a modest hotel in Conakry. He had been living under an assumed name, rarely leaving his room, using a local intermediary to bring him food and supplies. But the net had tightened around him, and there was nowhere left to run. His extradition to Burkina Faso took another week, as legal procedures had to be followed. But finally, on a Tuesday morning, a military transport plane landed at Ouagadougou Airport with Duogo in custody. Traoré did not go to the airport to witness the arrival. "This isn't a personal vendetta," he told his staff. "This is the law taking its course. I don't need to see him in chains to know that justice is being served." The trial of Bhaskara Duogo, Dr. David Sagano, and 15 co-conspirators became one of the most significant legal proceedings in Burkina Faso's history. The government had built a new courthouse specifically for cases of national importance, and this trial would be its inaugural event. Traoré insisted that the trial be conducted with absolute transparency. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom, with proceedings broadcast live on national television and streamed online. Every piece of evidence was made publicly available through a government website. Every witness testimony was transcribed and published. This level of openness was unprecedented. And some of Traoré's advisors worried it might backfire, that clever defense lawyers might use the public attention to claim their clients couldn't get a fair trial. But Traoré was adamant. "If we conduct this trial in secret," he said, "people will always wonder if justice was really done, or if we simply punished our political enemies. Transparency is the only way to build trust." The trial began on a Monday morning in April. The courthouse was packed with journalists, legal observers, victims of the corruption, and ordinary citizens who had waited in line for hours to secure seats in the public gallery. The chief prosecutor was a woman named Hélène Ouedraogo, who had been specifically chosen for her reputation as a thorough, methodical, and incorruptible lawyer. She opened the proceedings with a speech that set the tone for everything that would follow. "Your Honor, this trial is about more than the theft of money or minerals. It is about betrayal, the betrayal of public trust, the betrayal of national resources, the betrayal of future generations who will inherit a country robbed of its wealth. The defendants in this case didn't just break the law. They broke the social contract between government and governed. They took an oath to serve the people, and instead, they served themselves." Over the following weeks, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, financial records showing the flow of money from the fraudulent park project into the defendants' accounts, testimony from workers who described the clandestine mining operations, geological surveys proving that significant quantities of valuable minerals had been extracted from beneath Kaya Park, and perhaps most damningly, the encrypted files recovered from Duogo's safe. The files, once decoded by French cybersecurity experts, contained detailed records of the entire operation. There were production logs showing exactly how much coltan, tantalum, and gold had been extracted month by month. There were shipping manifests indicating where the minerals had been sent, primarily to intermediaries in neighboring countries who would then export them to China and Europe. There were profit calculations showing that the conspiracy had netted approximately 45 billion CFA francs over 2 years, equivalent to nearly 75 million US dollars. Most incriminatingly, there were emails and text message transcripts showing explicit discussions of the deception. In one exchange, Duogo had written to Sagano, "The park is perfect cover. Who questions environmental beautification? We plant flowers on top while we mine gold underneath. Poetic, really." The defense lawyers fought hard, but they were swimming against an overwhelming tide of evidence. They tried to argue that their clients had been following orders from even higher up, implying without quite stating that current government officials had been complicit. The prosecution countered by inviting those officials to testify under oath, and several did, categorically denying any knowledge of the illegal operations. The defense tried to claim that the mining operations had been authorized under old permits that predated the park construction. The prosecution produced documentation showing that those permits had been explicitly revoked years earlier, and that the defendants knew they had been revoked. The defense tried to argue that the environmental impact had been minimal, that no real harm had been done. The prosecution brought in environmental scientists who testified that the secret mining had contaminated groundwater, destabilized soil structures, and would require years of remediation. As the trial progressed, public interest remained intense. Every evening, television programs analyzed the day's testimony. Radio call-in shows were flooded with listeners offering their opinions. The trial had become not just a legal proceeding, but a national conversation about accountability and the rule of law. One of the most powerful moments came when the prosecution called a series of ordinary citizens to testify about how corruption had affected their lives. These weren't people directly involved in the Kaya case, but rather individuals whose stories illustrated the broader impact of systemic corruption. A nurse testified about how hospital equipment budgets had been embezzled, leaving her to treat patients with outdated or broken machines. A teacher spoke about how school construction funds had disappeared, forcing children to study in overcrowded, dilapidated buildings. A farmer described how an irrigation project that would have helped hundreds of families had been canceled because its budget had been stolen by officials who submitted false completion reports. These testimonies weren't directly relevant to the charges against Duogo and his co-conspirators, but they served a crucial purpose. They showed the human cost of corruption, the way it rippled out from specific acts of theft to affect an entire society. When it was his turn to testify in his own defense, Bhaskara Duogo cut a diminished figure. The confident minister who had once commanded rooms full of people was now a nervous, deflecting defendant. He admitted to some wrongdoing but tried to minimize his role, claiming he had been pressured by foreign mining interests and that most of the profits had gone to others. The prosecutor's cross-examination was devastating. Mr. Duogo, we have records showing that you purchased 3 luxury properties in Abidjan, a villa in Lomé, and a penthouse in Dubai. The total value exceeds 8 billion CFA francs. Where did that money come from? I had successful business ventures. Consulting work. For whom? Please name your clients. Duogo stumbled through vague answers, unable to name specific clients or describe the nature of the consulting work. Mr. Duogo, your salary as a government minister was approximately 15 million CFA francs per year. Even over a decade, that would not cover the cost of even one of your properties. Are you telling this court that your consulting work earned you more than 50 times your official salary? Duogo had no credible answer. The trial lasted 7 weeks. When it finally concluded, the judges, a panel of 3, retired to deliberate. The law required them to reach a verdict within 2 weeks, but they returned after just 4 days. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when the presiding judge, an elderly woman named Justice Clarisse Sommet, who was known for her no-nonsense approach, began reading the verdict. In the matter of the state versus Bhaskara Duogo and others, she began, her voice strong and clear, this court has reviewed extensive evidence regarding the systematic theft of national resources through the fraudulent Kaya Park development project. The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. The evidence presented has proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the defendants engaged in a coordinated conspiracy to defraud the state, to illegally extract protected minerals, to falsify government documents, and to enrich themselves at the expense of the Burkina Faso people. Justice Sommet proceeded to detail findings of guilt on multiple counts for each defendant. The sentences varied based on individual roles and levels of culpability, but they were severe. Bhaskara Duogo, 20 years in prison, complete forfeiture of all assets, lifetime ban from holding public office or government contracts. Dr. David Sagano, 15 years in prison, forfeiture of assets, lifetime public service ban. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, along with asset forfeitures and bans from government work. But Justice Sommet wasn't finished. She added a statement that went beyond the specific legal findings. This court wishes to note that the crimes committed by these defendants represent a profound betrayal of public trust. They swore oaths to serve their country, and instead they plundered it. They hid behind the language of development and environmental protection while systematically looting national wealth. Their actions have set back Burkina Faso's development by years and have stolen opportunities from countless citizens who deserved better from their leaders. However, this court also wishes to recognize that the prosecution of these crimes represents something equally important: the determination of a nation to hold its leaders accountable, to refuse to accept corruption as inevitable, and to insist that no one, regardless of their position or connections, is above the law. That determination, embodied in the thorough investigation and prosecution of this case, gives hope that Burkina Faso can build a future defined by integrity rather than impunity. As the verdicts were read, some defendants wept, others stared straight ahead in shock, and a few maintained expressions of defiant anger. But the outcomes were final, and the appeals process, while available to them, would take place with them behind bars. Outside the courthouse, thousands of people had gathered. When word of the verdicts spread, a roar went up from the crowd, not of vengeance but of vindication. People embraced, wept with relief, and chanted slogans about justice and accountability. President Traoré watched the scene on television from his office. He did not smile or celebrate. Instead, he felt the weight of what had been accomplished and what still needed to be done. With the trial concluded and the conspirators convicted, attention turned to what should be done with Kaya Park itself. The site had been closed to the public throughout the investigation and trial, surrounded by security fencing and guarded around the clock. Some voices argued that the park should simply be demolished, that it was too tainted by corruption to ever serve its intended purpose. Others suggested that the mining operations should be properly regulated and continued, with profits going to the state rather than private individuals. But Traoré had a different vision, one that he announced in a national address 3 weeks after the verdicts were handed down. My fellow citizens, Kaya Park was conceived in deception and built on theft. But the land itself is innocent. The earth beneath that park belongs to all of us, and we must decide together what it represents going forward. I propose that we transform Kaya Park into something unprecedented, a national truth reserve. It will not be demolished and forgotten. Instead, it will be preserved as an educational site, a place where future generations can come to learn about how corruption happens, how it harms society, and how it can be defeated. We will build a museum on the site, documenting the entire scandal. We will preserve sections of the underground tunnels where illegal mining took place, so people can see with their own eyes the physical reality of grand corruption. We will create educational programs for students, training modules for government officials, and research facilities for academics studying governance and accountability. Some may say this is dwelling on the past, that we should move forward rather than looking back. But I believe that remembering our mistakes is how we avoid repeating them. The National Truth Reserve will be a monument not to corruption, but to our collective decision to confront it and overcome it. The proposal was met with broad support, though some details needed to be worked out. An international architectural competition was launched to design the museum and educational facilities. Environmental remediation experts were brought in to assess and repair the damage caused by the illegal mining, and a commission was established to determine exactly what artifacts and documents should be preserved and how they should be presented. The transformation took 2 years. During that time, Traoré pushed forward with broader anti-corruption reforms. He established an independent anti-corruption commission with genuine investigative powers and protection from political interference. He implemented new transparency requirements for government contracts and procurement. He pushed through legislation protecting whistleblowers and mandating asset declarations for all senior officials. Not all of these reforms were popular with everyone. Some government officials, particularly those accustomed to the old ways of doing business, resisted. Some foreign companies that had benefited from corrupt arrangements lobbied against the changes. And some opposition politicians, while publicly supporting anti-corruption efforts, privately worried that the new transparency requirements would limit their own future opportunities for enrichment. But Traoré remained committed. He gave speeches across the country, visiting universities, markets, and villages to explain why these reforms mattered. He met with youth groups, women's organizations, and civil society activists, listening to their concerns and incorporating their suggestions. One of his most effective advocates turned out to be the young worker who had first brought forward the memory card documenting the nighttime operations at Kaya Park. His name was Amadou Ouedraogo, and Traoré had ensured he was protected and compensated for his courage. Now, Amadou traveled with a government-sponsored speakers program, telling his story to audiences across Burkina Faso and beyond. "I was afraid," Amadou would tell audiences. "I was afraid of losing my job, afraid of being hurt, afraid of retaliation against my family. But I was more afraid of what would happen if I stayed silent. I was afraid that my children would grow up in a country where stealing from the people was just accepted as normal. I was afraid that my silence would make me complicit." His words resonated powerfully, particularly with young people who were tired of cynicism and hungry for a different kind of politics. The National Truth Reserve officially opened on a clear morning in October, nearly 3 years after the initial discovery of corruption at Kaya Park. The date had been carefully chosen. October 15th was the anniversary of the 1987 assassination of Thomas Sankara. Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, whose anti-corruption stance and commitment to African self-determination had made him a lasting symbol of integrity in leadership. Thousands of people attended the opening ceremony, including international dignitaries, journalists from dozens of countries, and delegations of students from across West Africa. But the most honored guests were ordinary Burkinabe citizens, including many of the workers who had helped expose the corruption. The site had been transformed. The once deceptive park, with its fountains and manicured lawns designed to hide theft, now featured a striking modern museum building whose architecture deliberately echoed both traditional Burkinabe design and the mineral formations of the earth. Glass panels allowed visitors to look down into preserved sections of the illegal mining tunnels, lit dramatically to show their extent. Inside, the museum told the complete story of the scandal through photographs, videos, documents, and interactive displays. One section displayed the actual metal container that had been discovered in the first excavation, still containing some of the files that had helped crack the case. Another featured testimony videos from workers, investigators, and even some of the convicted conspirators who had agreed to be interviewed from prison. But the museum didn't only focus on the specific Kaya Park scandal. It placed that story within the broader context of corruption in Africa and globally, examining the historical roots of resource extraction, the international networks that facilitate money laundering, and the various ways that corruption manifests in daily life. One particularly powerful exhibit featured the cost calculator, an interactive display that showed visitors how much various corruption scandals had cost in terms of hospitals not built, schools not equipped, roads not maintained, and opportunities not provided. For the Kaya scandal specifically, it calculated that the stolen funds could have built and equipped 23 modern health clinics, provided scholarships for 15,000 students, constructed 450 kilometers of rural roads, installed solar power systems in 300 villages, or provided clean water access to 200,000 people. These concrete comparisons helped visitors understand that corruption wasn't just an abstract legal or political issue. It directly affected people's lives and futures. When it was time for Traoré to deliver his remarks at the opening ceremony, he stood not at a grand podium but on the ground itself, surrounded by the assembled guests in a more intimate arrangement. 3 years ago, he began, I came to this place and discovered that what appeared to be a beautiful park was actually a beautiful lie. What looked like progress was actually theft. What seemed like development for the people was actually enrichment for the few. Today we stand in the same place, but everything has changed. This is no longer a site of deception. It is a site of truth. This is no longer a place where corruption was hidden. It is a place where corruption is exposed, studied, and rejected. Some people ask me why we didn't simply bulldoze this place and start fresh. Why preserve the evidence of our national shame? My answer is simple. We preserve it because we must remember. We must remember how corruption happens, not through grand conspiracies involving cartoon villains, but through ordinary people making incremental compromises with their integrity. We must remember how corruption is hidden, not in darkness, but behind the bright lights of development projects and beautification programs. We must remember how corruption is defeated, not through violence or revolution, but through courage, investigation, transparency, and the rule of law. This National Truth Reserve exists to teach those lessons. It exists so that when my generation is gone, when the people who lived through this scandal have passed into history, the story will remain. The evidence will remain. The lessons will remain. But this place also represents something more hopeful. Our determination as a nation to be better than our worst moments. We were stolen from, yes. We were deceived, yes. But we did not accept it. We investigated. We prosecuted. We held people accountable. And we built this place to ensure that we would never forget why accountability matters. I often say that gold is not found in the ground alone. It is also found in integrity, in courage, in the willingness to speak truth to power. The young workers who came forward to expose this scandal, knowing they might face retaliation, they are gold. The investigators who followed every lead, traced every transaction, and built an unassailable case, they are gold. The judges who rendered verdicts based on evidence rather than pressure, they are gold. And all of you, citizens who demanded accountability, who refused to accept that corruption was simply how things work, who insisted that your country could be better, you are gold. This place exists because of you. It exists for you, and it exists for your children and grandchildren, so they will know that once, in a difficult time, Burkina Faso chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and integrity over impunity. Welcome to the National Truth Reserve. Welcome to a place where the earth tells stories. Welcome to a reminder that our greatest resource is not what lies beneath the ground, but what lies within our character. The applause was long and heartfelt. As Traoré stepped back from the microphone, he noticed an elderly woman in traditional dress approaching him. She was escorted by security, but she clearly had something she wanted to say. "Mr. President," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "I am 78 years old. I have lived through coups, droughts, and decades of corruption. I never thought I would see the day when powerful men would actually go to prison for stealing from the people. Thank you for giving me hope before I die." Traoré took her hands in his. "Mother," he said, "I should thank you. Your generation endured so much, survived so much, and never stopped believing that things could be better. We are simply trying to honor your faith." As the official ceremony concluded and visitors began touring the museum, Traoré walked alone to a quiet corner of the reserve, the place where the first excavation had taken place, where he had knelt and dipped his fingers in the water and noticed the golden shimmer that started everything. A small plaque had been installed there, reading, "On this spot, truth began its journey from beneath the ground to the light of day. May we always have the courage to dig where others prefer we not look." Traoré stood there for several minutes, lost in thought. He was thinking about all that had been accomplished, but also about all that remained to be done. Convicting corrupt officials was important, but changing the culture that enabled corruption in the first place would take generations. He was also thinking about the next challenges. Even as the Kaya Park scandal had been unfolding, his intelligence services had begun investigating irregularities in other government projects. There were hints of problems in the road construction sector, in pharmaceutical procurement, in military contracts. The fight against corruption would never truly be over. It would require constant vigilance, constant courage, and constant commitment. But standing there in the October sunshine, watching families walk through the reserve and children running excitedly toward the museum entrance, Traoré allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. Change was possible, accountability was achievable, and perhaps, just perhaps, Burkina Faso was showing a way forward not just for itself, but for others facing similar challenges. 5 years after the opening of the National Truth Reserve, its impact could be measured in ways both tangible and intangible. Over 500,000 people had visited the site, including school groups from every region of Burkina Faso and delegations from 32 other countries. The educational programs had reached more than 100,000 students. The research center had published dozens of studies on corruption, accountability, and governance reform. And the reserve had become a symbol recognized internationally, a model for how nations could confront and learn from their own failings. But perhaps more significantly, the cultural shift that Traoré had hoped for was beginning to manifest. A new generation of young people had grown up in a Burkina Faso where corruption was publicly challenged rather than quietly accepted. They had internalized the lessons of the Kaya scandal, that speaking up mattered, that evidence could defeat power, that accountability was possible. This generation was now entering government service, starting businesses, teaching in schools, and working in civil society organizations. They brought with them a different set of expectations, an unwillingness to tolerate the compromises and quiet corruption that their parents' generation had often accepted as inevitable. The change wasn't complete, and corruption certainly hadn't been eliminated. There were still scandals, still investigations, still prosecutions, but the trajectory had shifted. The default assumption was no longer that powerful people could act with impunity. International rankings reflected this shift. Burkina Faso had climbed 24 places on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. Foreign direct investment had increased as companies gained confidence in the rule of law. And perhaps most importantly, citizen surveys showed rising trust in government institutions, still far from perfect, but notably improved from the cynicism that had once been pervasive. The individuals involved in the original scandal had faded from public consciousness in different ways. Bhaskara Duogo remained in prison, having lost his appeal and now serving his sentence with little prospect of early release. Dr. Sagano had become ill during his incarceration and had been transferred to a prison medical facility. Most of the other convicted conspirators were still serving their sentences, though a few who had cooperated fully with investigations and shown genuine remorse had received reduced sentences. Amadou Ouedraogo, the worker who had first blown the whistle, had become a permanent staff member at the National Truth Reserve, where he led tours and spoke to visiting groups about the importance of courage and integrity. He had also written a book about his experience, which had become required reading in many schools. President Ibrahim Traoré himself had evolved in the public imagination from a leader primarily defined by anti-corruption efforts to a statesman working on broader development challenges. But he never allowed himself or his government to forget the lessons of Kaya Park. He kept a small container of soil from the site on his desk, earth mixed with traces of minerals, a constant reminder of what lies beneath beautiful surfaces. On the 5th anniversary of the National Truth Reserve's opening, Traoré visited once again. The site had matured beautifully. Trees planted at the opening had grown tall. Gardens cultivated by local volunteers bloomed with native flowers, and the museum had expanded with new exhibits and programs. As he walked the pathways, now filled with visitors of all ages, Traoré stopped to speak with a group of students who were sketching exhibits as part of an art project. One young girl, perhaps 12 years old, asked him a question. "Mr. President, do you think we've won the fight against corruption?" Traoré considered the question carefully before answering. "No," he said honestly. "We haven't won and we never will, not completely. Corruption is like weeds in a garden. You can clear them out, but they will always try to grow back. The fight against corruption isn't something you win once and then it's over. It's something you commit to every day, in every decision, in every action. But what we have done, what you and your generation will continue to do, is change the terms of the fight. We've shown that accountability is possible. We've proven that no one is above the law. We've created institutions and practices that make corruption harder to hide and easier to punish. And we've built places like this to ensure that we remember why it matters. The question isn't whether we've won. The question is whether we're still fighting. And as long as people like you are asking questions, paying attention, and refusing to accept corruption as normal, yes, we're still fighting. And that's how we'll eventually win." The girl nodded thoughtfully and returned to her sketching. As Traoré continued his walk, He reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he had dipped his fingers in the water and noticed an unusual golden shimmer. The earth beneath Kaya still held minerals, still possessed wealth. But now that wealth was protected by law, watched over by citizens, and held in trust for future generations rather than stolen for private gain. The park had been built to hide corruption. Now it stood as a monument to exposing it. The green grass that once covered theft now grew in soil cleansed by truth. And in the museum's main hall, where thousands of visitors passed each week, a simple inscription captured the entire story in just a few words. Some people plant greenery, others plant lies, but the earth always remembers the difference. Historical note. While this story is fictional, it reflects real challenges faced by many African nations and developing countries worldwide. Illicit mineral extraction, particularly of rare earth elements like coltan and tantalum, has fueled conflict and corruption across the continent. The courage of whistleblowers, the importance of transparent governance, and the possibility of holding powerful people accountable are themes that resonate far beyond any single country or case. The character of President Ibrahim Traoré is inspired by leaders who have genuinely fought corruption despite significant personal risk. Though any resemblance to specific individuals is not intended, the National Truth Reserve concept, while fictional, draws on real examples of how nations have grappled with difficult histories, from truth and reconciliation commissions to museums that preserve evidence of past wrongdoing. The fundamental message remains: accountability is possible, corruption can be confronted, and nations can choose integrity over impunity. But these choices require courage at every level of society, from ordinary workers willing to speak up, to investigators willing to follow evidence wherever it leads, to leaders willing to prioritize justice over convenience. The earth beneath our feet holds many treasures, but our greatest treasure is the integrity we choose to uphold, the courage we summon to speak truth, and the commitment we maintain to building societies where justice is not just a distant ideal, but a lived reality.